Hey friends, welcome back to the Journal Feed. My name is Nick Zelt, and this is the only place to be spoon-fed the latest and greatest of emergency medicine. This is the audio version of the past week summaries, which this week were brought to you by our authors Clark Strunk, Doug Wallace, Megan Hilbert, Joshua Belfer, and Clay Smith. So, the first article, titled Vasopressors or Fluids in Early Septic Shock, out of the New England Journal of Medicine. Now, the Surviving Sepsis campaign recommends a 30 cc per kg bolus within the first 3 hours of you hopefully identifying that your patient has sepsis. But there is no recommendation on when to start vasopressors. When is the right time if the patient has not responded well enough to your fluids that they actually maintain a MAP over 65? Should we start vasopressors, quote unquote, early instead of potentially drowning our patients? The previous literature is mixed at best, and the largest trial was actually stopped early for futility. And so here we have the Arise Fluids trial, which tried to answer this question yet again. Others have tried. This was a multicenter international, randomized control trial of about 1,000 patients presenting to the emergency department with septic shock diagnosed within 6 hours who received at least 1, but not more than 2 liters of IV fluids. They had to have more than just sepsis with septic shock and a systolic blood pressure less than 90 or a MAP less than 65. If you were randomized to the vasopressor group, you could still give fluids in boluses of 250 cc's, which really is almost nothing intravascularly. And if you're in the fluids group, then you could give boluses of 500 cc's if your patient is still hypotensive. So if you're randomized to the vasopressor group, then obviously you start vasopressors. If you were randomized to the fluids group and you were already on vasopressors, then you didn't necessarily need to stop them. And indeed, time to pressors only differed by an hour between the groups. Now, the median volume of fluid administered at randomization was 1.5 liters in both groups, with the liberal fluid group receiving about a liter more fluids by the 6-hour mark, which at least is a fairly reasonable difference. I think this is one of the hardest parts about these trials is that even if you're in the vasopressor group, you tend to end up getting a pretty decent amount of fluids. 25 cc's per kg versus, if you're in the liberal fluids group, then 38 cc's per kg. So both of these patients still got quite a bit of fluids. And there was no difference in days alive and out of the hospital at 90 days or 28 days. 90-day mortality, use of renal replacement therapy, and invasive ventilation also showed no differences between the groups. So overall, this was a pretty negative-looking trial. There are some interesting things that you can pull away from it, though. It is interesting to see that the majority of the patients who got vasopressors got peripheral pressors. That's always nice to see these days. And there was a significant difference in the rates of ICU admission, 77% if you were started on pressors right away, and 68% if you were getting fluids. So that, unfortunately, is a downside to starting pressors early. You've got more resource utilization because a lot more of these patients are going to go to the ICU because you can't send them to the floor on pressors. Interestingly, the group on vasopressors received pressors for a shorter total duration, 22 hours versus 30 hours if you needed pressors at all in the fluids group. Also, a shorter time in the ICU if you were started on pressors early, which kind of makes sense. I think potentially some of these patients you could have avoided starting pressors in at all. So yes, I expect that the duration of pressors and ICU stays will look shorter. What I would have loved to see about this trial was a blinded trial, but that's going to be hard because like I said, you can't admit patients to the floor if they're on vasopressors. That's not necessarily a safe thing for you to be doing. Again, I think one of the major limitations of these trials is that it's really difficult not to end up having your vasopressor group still get a decent amount of fluids. In this trial, they got almost the recommended 30 cc's per kg, which still is a fair amount of fluids. Even though if you're in the rapid fluids group, the liberal fluids group, then you did get a lot more fluids up front, about a liter in the first hour compared to less than 200 cc's in the vasopressor group. So you see that at first, the vasopressors do make everybody calm down because the map has likely improved, but at the end of the day, they still end up getting a decent amount of fluids. So I don't really think that there's necessarily a right answer for everybody, and you've just got to assess the patient in front of you. Do they look like they're about to start drowning? Then maybe reach for pressors. If you still think you've got room, then it seems like you might be able to save your patient an ICU admission if you keep on with the fluids, at least as long as you can. Which is a shame, because I wish we could just start pressors really early and go from there. Then you could really see, kind of play with the two and see which one your patient needs more. So in a spoonful, again, fluids up front is a reasonable choice rather than early pressors. You may be able to avoid an ICU admission without compromising safety, but you should definitely, treat each patient as their own. Okay, then let's skip to the fourth article. Titled Bicarbonate for In-Hospital Cardiac Arrest, a randomized clinical trial out of the JAMA. Now, the use of sodium bicarb during an in-hospital cardiac arrest seems to occur in about half of patients, despite the current recommendations being against giving it empirically, just willy-nilly. While I will accept that it is some way for you to address some of your H's and T's, doing so blindly probably isn't something that's going to be helpful. And indeed, there's very little evidence to support this practice. Some give it because they figure, hey, after the arrest or even during or because of the arrest, you're going to get severe acidosis, which is common. I mean, your body is shutting down. This leads to poor cardiac contractility, resistance to catecholamines, worsening ischemic brain injury. So perhaps if we were able to keep the acidosis status of our patients, a little bit improved, then we wouldn't have all those things happening and we could do better by our patients. We treat the acidosis, our patients are better. Or at least that's the logic. So in this trial, when a patient had an arrest in a hospital, they gave bicarbs just 50 cc's right after epi, and then again after the next epi for a maximum of 2 doses. And they recruited 913 patients, and what did they find? Well, there's not a significant difference in the primary outcome of sustained ROSC, 39% and 37%, that 37% coming from the control group, which had a matched placebo. There's also no significant difference in favorable neurological outcomes at 30 days or 90 days. However, the point estimate did favor the bicarbonate group. Now, it is worth knowing that 6% and 7% of these groups were given bicarb otherwise during the arrest, because there was some thought by the physician that, hey, it's actually indicated in this circumstance, so we should give it, and not just the empirically thinking that the patient was giving it because they weren't sure if it was actually that or the control. So it seems like it is true. Don't give it to everybody. There seems to be no reason for that, or at least I think that. I'm more of not a kitchen sink kind of guy. But there are still some indications for why you might want to give it, like hyperkalemia, a sodium channel blockade. These are obvious reasons in which it might actually be beneficial. Also, there is some thought that if it's a prolonged arrest, that maybe in those circumstances it would be helpful, and they weren't specifically, testing for these things in this trial. These are questions that it would be beneficial for us to have more clarity on, though. And we did see that if you were giving bicarb, then the pH and the sodium levels did indeed improve, although they were still acidotic afterwards. It just didn't come with an improvement in ROSC. Something that we also didn't see was danger to giving bicarb just empirically. So, if you're the type that just likes to give stuff and it's not going to distract you from doing other things, then this is also a decent argument to just kind of go for it. Honestly, the dose of 50 cc's and another 50 cc's is not a huge dose of bicarb anyways. I'm surprised if we'd be making a huge difference. But, all the same, it's up to you. In a spoonful, guidelines seem to be correct. Even in hospital cardiac arrest, don't just give bicarb routinely, as it's not likely to help your patient. But this does not address using it for specific indications. Okay, that's all the articles we've got from this week. Let's do a quick wrap up of what we talked about. In the first article, early vasopressors, sadly, doesn't seem to be the way to go until you've finished giving fluids, since that's easier and they don't push your patient to the ICU. And then from the fourth article, routine use of bicarbonate in in-hospital cardiac arrest, well, it did not show any meaningful improvements, but nor was it harmful. Now, if you were hearing this right now, then you were not a part of the members feed, and so you missed 3 articles from this past week. What did we talk about that you missed? Well, we talked about, hey, what if you started norepinephrine really early? Was there an association with better mortality? And then we looked at a SERMA that asked, hey, should you be pocusing the bladder of infants before you put in a catheter? And then finally, what is the cause way down the road 2 years later for excessive crying in infants? Links to all the original articles can be found at journalfeed.org or just follow the links in your show notes. Our goal here is for you to keep up the easy way through spoon feeding. Thank you.